Thanks for joining today's Ideas Incubator webinar. This is the second in the Future of Study Abroad series. My name is Megan Zacher and my pronouns are she, her, and I am the Interim Program Manager for the Capacity Building Program for U.S. Study Abroad, also known as Ideas at World Learning. I'd like to introduce Ms. Heidi Manley, the Chief of USA Study Abroad, part of the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at ECA. She serves as the lead for American student mobility within the State Department and oversees two of the department's leading programs to support American students. The first is the Benjamin A. Gilman International Scholarship Program, and the second is the Critical Language Scholarship Program, which she launched in 2006. Heidi also has the lead for creating and overseeing a number of capacity building initiatives to increase and diversify American student mobility, including the Capacity Building Program for U.S. Study Abroad, for accredited U.S. higher education institutions, also known as IDEAS, which stands for Increase and Diversify Education Abroad for U.S. Students, and Study Abroad Engagement Grants for U.S. Embassies and Fulbright Commissions worldwide. Heidi previously served as the Deputy Director of ECA's Office of Global Educational Programs and as a Special Projects Officer in the Office of Academic Exchange Programs, where she oversaw a number of programs and initiatives under the flagship Fulbright program. Heidi, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Megan. Just to confirm, you can hear me? Awesome, just to make sure technology is being my friend today. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all. The last time I checked, we had almost 450 registrants for this webinar that representing 45 states and 18 countries. So I wanted to make sure I was as inclusive as possible in welcoming you all to today's event. I am absolutely delighted to be here with you all today. And I do apologize in advance for addressing you from outside, but I am frankly hiding a little bit from my children who, like many of your children, might be at home and engaged in virtual school. And since my job has now expanded to include tech support, classroom monitor, and spell checker, among other things, I wanted to make sure I could focus on you all and address you all from where I thought I could. And the fact that my children are home with me and that I'm at home addressing all of you is a reminder, not that I need one, of the unprecedented time that we are in. Despite these challenges, we are optimistically looking forward to a strong return to American student mobility, which includes our current open application for our Critical Language Scholarship Program, which closes on November 17th, and our recently closed application cycle for our Benjamin A. Gilman International Scholarship Program, with the next cycle opening again in January 2021. We are, however, also realistic about the current challenges, as well as those that potentially may lie ahead. At USA Study Abroad, we are deeply proud to be part of the U.S. Study Abroad community and deeply appreciative of all of your continued efforts, including and especially during these trying times. We are also doing what we can to try to support all of you all, as well as our students, during this time of great uncertainty, as well as, again, optimistically trying to prepare for the future ahead. For example, we recently launched languages.state.gov, which serves as a one-stop shop for all of our funded language programs offered to U.S. citizens by the Departments of State, Defense, and Education, as well as the National Security Agency. We've also introduced a number of flexibilities to our Gilman and CLS program, including supporting and allowing for virtual programs, having longer application cycles, and allowing for deferrals within our Gilman program. We're also going to open our next call in November for applications for U.S. colleges and universities to apply for small grants of up to $35,000 through our IDEAS program, and that deadline will be in February 2021. In November, we are also launching a free webinar series on what's next, or the future of the internationalization of higher ed in the COVID-19 era, in conjunction with AIEA, U.S. higher education experts, and experts from around the world with support from our U.S. embassies and Fulbright commissions. Note that Megan is helpfully showing a resource we put together that we will include in the packet of presentation materials sent to you all with relevant links so that you have all of this information about the items that I just mentioned. And we also launched initiatives such as this webinar today to talk about the very important topic of risk mitigation. And I'm looking forward to hearing from our experts who are joining us today, as well as from all of you during our question and answer period. We worked really hard this past spring, as did most of you, to bring our American program participants home. as borders were rapidly closing and flights were being canceled quickly. We also shifted our CLS program to a virtual format in about 7 weeks, and we tried to adjust and respond within our programs as we could. We are always searching to improve, so I'm very grateful to our experts for being with us today and sharing their time and their expertise. We have with us Andrea Bordeaux from Vanderbilt University and Maureen Handrahan from Michigan State University, who have graciously agreed to be with us today. I also just want to say thank you to Megan and Amira from World Learning for all they're doing in making this webinar possible, as well as Rebecca Gailey from my own team for all of their great work and to making, again, today's event happen. And I just finally want to thank all of you for being here with us today and to thank you in advance for your questions, for your ideas. This is supposed to be a very group dynamic, so we hope to hear from you as well as from our experts. I'm really looking forward to today's event, and I will turn it back over to you, Megan. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Before we get started with our presenters, just a quick overview of World Learning and Ideas. World Learning Inc. is a nonprofit organization that encompasses SIT Study Abroad, the Experiment in International Living, the SIT Graduate Institute, and Global Exchange Programs in Washington, D.C. We partner with USA Study Abroad to implement ideas. The overarching goal of Ideas is to expand and diversify U.S. study abroad. It does this through an annual grant competition and through in-person and virtual activities like the one you're participating in today. Our hope is that today's webinar, The Future of Study Abroad, Risk Mitigation in a COVID World, contributes to your institution's study abroad planning as you decide when and how to safely resume international exchanges for Americans in the future. We're delighted that this webinar gives us the opportunity to collaborate with Andrea Bordeaux and Maureen Handrahan. I'll turn it over to them now to introduce themselves and get the webinar started.
Hi, Meg. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the introduction from Heidi and from everyone at Ideas and World Learning. Just a quick, brief introduction. As Heidi said, my name is Andrea Bordeaux. I'm from Vanderbilt University. My pronouns, her, hers, and today we're going to be talking about risk mitigation in a COVID world. That relates directly to my role here at Vanderbilt as I currently oversee travel, health, safety, and security for all of our faculty, staff, our undergraduate students, graduate students, and professional students. I will let Maureen introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be with you, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I'm really excited to talk all things education abroad and risk management, two of my favorite things. So at Michigan State University, my title is Coordinator for International Health and Safety. I oversee operational management of all health, safety, security managers for all university travel. So like Andrea, that includes faculty, staff, graduate students, and education abroad. I am part of a two-person office, and what I like about my position is that I get to focus mostly on our education abroad programs. So I look forward to chatting with you all today.
Next slide, please. So as we said before, a very, very warm welcome to you all. We are so excited to hear about the number of countries represented among participants here and states as well. It's nice to be able to reach this kind of audience and bounce ideas off of all of you and then get your feedback and your questions. So we're looking forward to chatting with you today and learning from you as well. Just to run through a quick agenda of what we're going to be talking about, we're going to just do a quick overview of risk. What is risk? What is risk assessment? Let's just get on the same page with terminology so that we know where we're headed today. We will also go over the basic goals of risk assessment. So what are we trying to accomplish? Obviously, to mitigate and to reduce. That's the goal here. We'll also be walking you through some SRA or security risk assessment tools today that we have developed at our own institutions and are also pretty standard among the field that Maureen and I both represent, as our positions are dedicated to health, safety, and security in higher education. So we'll walk you through some of those tools that we've worked out. We're also going to go over what's new and what hasn't changed. What we mean by that is risk has always existed in the study abroad landscape. It's always been a part of our work and what we do and what we've needed to account for. However, COVID has presented its own unique challenges. So we want to be able to walk you through what we think is new here, and maybe what parts don't require as much special attention as maybe we've wanted to give them. And so let's walk through that together and chat about our ideas there. And finally, we will walk you through a criteria for assessing COVID and how it fits into standard risk assessment. And we'll do that through a case study. And so we'll just walk you through a case study, have a chat about it, and then move on to Q&A. I think most importantly to mention before we get into the meat of our quick chat today is that we're going to be trying to tie all of this back to your institution's strategic plan and our ultimate goal of global engagement. And so that's what we're going to be thinking about as we present moving forward. Next slide. Okay, so first, risk. What is risk? Let's have a quick terminology check-in here. I'm sure that many of you have heard the terms risk capacity or risk appetite, tolerance, kind of maybe thrown around. These terms are not really interchangeable in that way. And so in order to be on the same page, I just thought it might help to walk us through sort of these three separate terminologies that all come together, overlap, and inform really good decision making. And so first of all, risk appetite, that's your willingness to take risk. That's the fact that we have any programming, it's innate to operation. Our risk appetite is always present, and it's clear that we all have one given what we have been doing prior to COVID. Risk capacity is our ability to take, or our that we can afford to take in that sense. And that really relates back to bandwidth. That is going to be a very individual, institution by institution thing. And so the risk capacity of an institution needs to be assessed through perhaps starting with the size of education abroad office and staff, and the ability of that staff to look at programs and to manage moving forward. How can we support students? And how do the supports for students extend beyond education abroad at your institution? So we'll talk about that as well. And then finally, that risk tolerance that limits boundaries, the need to take risk, and thinking through how risk is essential in order to really engage globally and to align with those strategic missions. Our students, they expect some level of global engagement. When pretty much any student comes into a university setting, they will have ideas about what attaining skills at a higher education institution will look like. And many times what we hear from them is that there's going to be some global piece, some ability to travel or to connect globally, to enhance their own skills in terms of global communication. And that's going to be a huge part of things. And so how we fit that into our overall capacity for risk and tolerance for risk is going to be very important. Next slide. So the goals of risk assessment, quick Oxford Dictionary definition: systematic process of evaluating the potential risks that may be involved in a projected activity. And so what we're trying to do with risk assessment is first identify those risks, analyze those risks, evaluate or rank them, mitigate them, and then monitor and review. And ultimately, what we're trying to accomplish is, again, that active global engagement while reducing impact severity, reducing likelihood, or both. That's going to be our goal here. And ultimately, we want to move away from a place where we could potentially be imposing unrealistic goals based on using the risk assessment tools that we have for all other risks that have been present in education abroad for a long time. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Maureen to begin a discussion of our risk assessment tools.
All right, thanks, Andrea. So like Andrea mentioned, I'm going to spend the next few slides walking you all through a risk assessment methodology. It's a methodology and set of risk assessment tools that I use often in my job at MSU, but it's something that the specific matrix that you're looking at right now is something that we actually borrowed from the United Nations Security Risk Management methodology. So it's not a methodology that is exclusive to the university setting or to study abroad programs, but it's something that we like and we think it's quite applicable to our study abroad programs and university projects in general. So just to continue on with providing some definitions, so how are we defining risk, at least in the context of this matrix and the tools that we'll be using? Simply put, a definition that again is borrowed from the United Nations Department of Safety and Security is that risk is the likelihood of a harmful event occurring and the impact of that event if it were to occur. So if you look at this colorful matrix here, along the horizontal axis, you'll see that's where the matrix is assessing impact of a risk. And then along the vertical axis there, you will see that is where the matrix is assessing the likelihood of a given risk. When you combine both of those factors together, impact and likelihood, you get an overall assessment of the level of risk posed by a specific threat, issue, or concern. So for example, something that's very likely to happen and would cause severe consequences if it did happen is considered a high risk. Something that is likely to happen but really only has minor consequences if it happens is something that would be considered low risk. You can probably see how those two axes come together just by looking at the matrix, but we will walk through a visual example a little bit later. So then your mitigation strategies, what you're trying to do is reduce that risk rating by either, as Andrea mentioned, reducing the likelihood of a threat impacting your program, or reducing the impact of a threat if it were to hit your program, or ideally, you're trying to do both. It's not always going to be possible to reduce both likelihood and impact, but that really is the ideal scenario when you're able to do both. One of the reasons why I like this particular risk assessment matrix, even though there's lots out there, if you just do a quick Google search for risk assessment matrix, you'll see pages and pages of options. And I do encourage you to do that because what I'm presenting here is certainly not the be all and end all of risk assessment methodology. It's what I tend to like and I have found most useful in my job at MSU. There's lots of other options out there. One of the reasons why I gravitated towards this particular matrix, it's not just its lovely colors, although those are quite helpful, but also because you'll notice along that horizontal axis where it's measuring the impact of risks, you will notice that top line there does talk about the potential for impact to a person's well-being, but also as you go down, you will also notice that it also assesses risk to a program's viability. That's one of the reasons why I think it's particularly applicable to study abroad programs. Obviously, our students and our faculty members' health and safety is our #1 priority, but also as someone working in study abroad, it's also incumbent on us to think about risk to a program's ability to function, because in addition to supporting student health and safety abroad, we also want them to be having successful programs. The other part of this risk matrix that I want to point out is that dashed line that you see running through the middle. That is there to represent your institution's risk tolerance. So think of that risk tolerance as a curved line that can shift depending on where your institution's risk tolerance is. So if you feel that your institution has maybe a low risk tolerance, that curved line might stay right where it is. It might be suggesting that your institution is not going to be comfortable accepting any risks that fall above that curved line. But if you have a slightly higher risk tolerance, you might say, I think we could shift that line up a little bit, and we would be willing to consider running a program even if some risks as we identify and mitigate are still falling into those medium boxes. I don't have an answer for you for where that line should exist for your institution. That's a conversation to have with your colleagues, with stakeholders, with senior leadership. The one thing I would suggest is that staying below those medium boxes is probably a comfortable place for most study abroad programs. But again, that's entirely up to your institution. Next slide, please. All right, so now that we know, okay, we need to evaluate risks and put them into that matrix to see what the overall risk rating is. Well, how do we know what risks we need to apply to that matrix? Put another way, what are new threats or vulnerabilities that exist if you are considering running a program while the COVID-19 pandemic is ongoing? The first is uncertainty. That's probably not something I need to spend a ton of time on. You probably live that every day. I know I sure do. But what I really mean by that is the fact that the COVID landscape is shifting all the time, both in terms of a country's COVID trajectories. We're seeing those go up and down, the evolution of public health advice, and the fact that we're still learning more about this disease and we're still getting more information from the medical community. Novelty is related to uncertainty. They don't call it the novel coronavirus for nothing. This is quite literally a new virus. So again, lots that we're still learning about. The other thing that's also novel about COVID-19 that I would especially encourage you all to think about is, I would argue that whatever mitigation strategies you are developing in order to consider running programs while COVID-19 is ongoing, a lot of those strategies are probably to a large degree untested. Now, maybe you've run programs before where there were significant public health concerns like Zika, like Ebola, for example, and certainly you might have some really good lessons learned from those examples, but I think we can all agree that this pandemic is really on a whole new scale. So that's something you need to consider as well, is the relatively untested nature of whatever mitigation strategies you might be putting in place for COVID-19 specifically. I would also encourage everyone, if you think back to that matrix and you're trying to assess the likelihood of a COVID event impacting your program, I would argue that you should consider a COVID event impacting your program to be a likely event, maybe even very likely. So why do I say that? Well, in part, it's because COVID itself, what we know about the disease thus far is that it's very contagious, it spreads very easily, and also because there are a lot of secondary impacts that COVID-19 has that can really impact program logistics in addition to potentially impacting the health of your participants. And I won't run through them one by one, but that fourth bullet point, new logistical challenges, runs through just a very short list of some of those new challenges. When you're thinking about the likelihood of COVID, I would encourage everyone to think of it in comparison with the risk posed by, let's say, terrorism. So if you have been running education abroad programs, running study abroad programs over the last few years, you probably remember the November 2015 Paris terrorist attacks. And in my view, that really sent a bit of a shockwave through the study abroad world. I know I was certainly a part of a lot of conversations at my institution and in the study abroad community about the risk of terrorism in Western Europe. We at MSU run a lot of programs in major urban centers in Western Europe. We're definitely not alone. That's probably true for many of you participating in this webinar. And I know when we considered our risk assessment in relation to the impact of terrorism to decide if we still, as an institution, felt comfortable running those programs, one thing that was really clear is everything we heard from experts, from government advisories, suggested that while if a terrorist event impacted a program, it did have the potential to have very severe consequences. However, terrorist events are still, on the whole, relatively rare events. So when you put those two factors together, overall, the risk of terrorism was assessed to be low for our study abroad programs. COVID's a little bit different. The impacts might not be as severe in some cases, but I think we should all assume that a COVID event of some kind impacting our programs is a fairly likely thing to happen. That's not to suggest that it's necessarily the most likely scenario that a student is going to become very ill from COVID, but imagine, you probably already have, a student developing something that could be a COVID-19 symptom and your institution needing to react to support that student, try to find a COVID test for them, et cetera. Another new COVID risk that we are talking about, or just really starting to talk about at MSU, is faculty health. So at Michigan State University, we have never asked our faculty directors who run our faculty-directed programs to attest to their physical fitness to run a program. That's never something we were involved with before, and I really don't think we're going to start doing that. But one thing that I have in the back of my mind is the fact that when I look at that category of people who might be at higher risk for COVID, that's a broad category. And I do wonder about some of our faculty members' ability to run programs and even their comfort level running programs. So certainly that's something I'm keeping in mind while also needing to balance privacy concerns and the ethics and legality of that consideration as well. The last, or not last, but the last COVID-related new risk that I will point out is related to forecasting and timing. And this is really related to the novelty of COVID-19 and the uncertainty as well. As we all have seen, COVID trajectories in a country can change very quickly. I think about Spain, for example. For a lot of the late spring and summer, Spain seemed to really have the coronavirus under control. And then all of a sudden, or at least it sure seemed all of a sudden, we saw those cases shoot up and Spain became a real hotspot again. I think that just goes to show that when we are thinking far in advance of a program's departure date about whether or not the program can run, we're needing to make those decisions without really knowing if what could look like a good COVID situation, if that's going to be sustainable. Not only do we need to be making those decisions well in advance of when a program may run, but we also need to make decisions about, are we going to open this program up to applications? Are we going to make financial deposits for this program? So that certainly is, I think, one of the biggest challenges related to COVID. And then also don't forget about the existing risks. So risks that predate COVID and risks that may be heightened due to COVID. So I don't know about all of you, but sometimes I feel like my job is all COVID all the time, and there's good reason for that. But also, if you're assessing the viability of a program, don't forget about things like the aforementioned risk of terrorism, risk of crime, things of that nature that are still going to exist in addition to COVID. So for example, maybe you are looking at some places to potentially resume programming if that's within your institution's risk tolerance. Maybe you're looking at Thailand. It's one of the few countries in the world that does not have a CDC level 3 travel health notice right now. So you might very reasonably be thinking, Thailand, looking pretty good. If that's something you're thinking about, I would encourage you to also be paying attention to the ongoing civil unrest that is happening in Thailand right now, which is not to suggest that I think it is irresponsible to be looking at potentially resuming programming in Thailand, but don't forget to look at risks beyond COVID. I also would point that there could be some risks that whether they predate COVID or not, they might be heightened due to COVID. So I mentioned before civil unrest may be related to protests, anti-lockdown protests, but also potentially what I'm calling rising xenophobic sentiment. That could be anything from anti-US sentiment, anti-Asian sentiment, or just a general aversion to visitors. Something to keep in mind when you're thinking about when the time will be right for your institution to start sending students abroad again. So now how do we take these risks and then plug them into the risk matrix? Megan, if you'll hit next slide. So here's one of the templates that I use at MSU and that I've shared with you all. I like it because it's a good way to organize your thoughts. It's a good way to analyze risks and develop mitigation strategies in a systematic way. One thing I'll tell you, when I use this assessment template at MSU, I have this template and that colorful matrix side by side. Unfortunately, I really wasn't able to do that in a PowerPoint presentation without it just making both impossible to read. But really think of the two as going hand in hand. So in addition to this being a good systematic way to look at risk, I also like this because it will help you keep your risk assessments consistent. It's also a tool that you can use with faculty. If you have, say, a faculty-directed program, you can bring that faculty member in with you, or at least meet with them on Zoom maybe, and walk this through together with them and get them in the headspace of thinking about risk management and thinking about what they can do to adjust their program to better support student health and safety in this environment. The other reason why I like this template is it's something you can present to your leadership or to your colleagues. Here's the risk assessment we did for this program. What do you think? Here's the sort of overview of our approach to risk and our approach to mitigation for this program. This is something that I recommend doing on a program by program basis if you can. You could probably use it to assess a country as a whole, but I really think it's better suited to something at the program level. So you may be looking at that column, the first column there, risk. What I threw on this template was just some examples. There's lots of other risks that you could and probably should include here. Availability of COVID testing, transportation safety, transportation disruptions, reputational risk. What I listed here was really just to give you an idea of the types of risks you could include on this template. And next slide, please, Megan. So now let's walk through an example for how we're going to use that template in conjunction with the matrix. So let's assess that first risk that I had in the column of a potential for a sudden border closure to interrupt a program. So at MSU, we have a lot of faculty-directed programs that tend to run in the summer, and a lot of them like to run in multiple locations. That's an important part of the comparative nature of the program. So what if one of those countries is in, what if one of those programs is in country A, and all of a sudden the borders close between country A and B, and they're no longer able to travel to country B as originally scheduled? Not only is the academic content of that program now in jeopardy, but you might actually have a group of students and faculty stranded with no accommodations. So here's how I assess that risk. So if you look, I'm assessing that the potential impact of this risk is severe, not necessarily because it will cause injury, but because it will cause a severe disruption to the program. And I'm also assessing that the likelihood of this risk is moderately likely. I don't know that for sure, but that's my best judgment when I'm paying attention to reputable sources. I would encourage you, when you're making similar judgments, to use actually that language. I assess this risk to be X. By using that, I think you make it clear that you're making a judgment call, an informed judgment call, but a judgment call nonetheless. So when you put those two together, you will notice that the overall risk rating for this program vis-a-vis potential sudden border closures is medium. So now how can we mitigate this risk? Well, one thing that we're talking about doing at MSU is not allowing multi-country programs. It seems very intuitive, but that would be a big deal for our university. It's probably the right thing to do, but it's certainly a change from the way we normally run our portfolio of programs. So by not allowing multi-country programs, we've been able to mitigate the impact of that program. If you just click Megan, I think that will highlight for us there. There we go. So we've been able to reduce that so that it's no longer likely that there will be severe disruptions to the program. We aren't really able to mitigate the likelihood of this risk impacting our program just because, unfortunately, I have no control over border closures. But still, even by doing that, the end result does demonstrate that we've moved that risk from medium to a low category. If you click Megan, I think that'll show up. Great. And next slide. All right, so now that you've seen how the risk assessment template and the matrix work together, what will your risk template look like when it's all filled out? So I didn't complete the whole risk template for you, and I know this text is very small. This is really just to give you a sense of, as you start filling it out, what is it going to look like? And in the end, what I hope you will have is a product where you've done a few things that I think will be very helpful and support your university's risk mitigation strategy. You've outlined all of the possible risks that you need to consider. You have assessed the extent to which they are likely to happen and the potential for their impact on the program. You've assessed what that risk looks like. You've outlined the mitigation steps, and then you have an end mitigated risk rating. So you'll have that for every single risk, and then you'll also have all of the risk ratings for your program as a whole. And again, you'll have that nice document for your own record keeping, for your own tracking mitigation strategies, and to potentially present to your leadership. Next slide, please. Okay. So now that you've had a look at the template and how it works, let's dive a little bit deeper into some of the COVID-related risks that should probably show up in that column. So how do you know really what needs to go into your assessment of COVID risks, quote unquote? So my recommendation is, to the extent possible, break up that notion of COVID risks into as many discrete parts as you can. Think of it in terms of supporting students through quarantine, assessing the availability of COVID testing, and looking at the number of local cases and/or COVID prevalence. Trying to find that sweet spot between having multiple indicators from different sources without just having so many indicators that you just have a huge list and no way to put it all together into a comprehensible picture. And no matter what indicators you end up selecting, I definitely encourage you to be open to changing those indicators. So if you're wondering, okay, what indicators is MSU looking at to assess COVID prevalence? I will emphasize discussions are ongoing, but here is a list of what is emerging as some of our key indicators for COVID prevalence. So of course, one of the most common ways of looking at COVID spread in a given location is the 5-day or 7-day moving average and whether that's been declining over a period of time. I also like this map that you'll see on the screen here that I call the Harvard map. I believe it's because it was initiated by the Harvard Global Health Institute. They look at COVID case trajectory in terms of daily new cases per 100,000 people. I like this map for a few different reasons. One, the physicians on my risk committee like it. They like the fact that it looks at cases per 100,000 population. They like that from a public health perspective. The map is also really intuitive. It's really easy to show this to a program director and say, look, your risk rating is red as opposed to green. That's just a very intuitive, that stoplight system. And also one thing you can't tell from this map, but if you actually go to the website that's listed down there and listed again at the end of the slide or at the end of this presentation, you're also going to be able to track the change to the risk rating and COVID case trajectory over time, which is really crucial to risk assessment, in my opinion. One thing we're also paying close attention to is not only has the country reopened its borders to travelers, but what happened when they did. I have certainly noticed, paying close attention to COVID case trajectories, that sometimes when a country reopens its borders, there is a subsequent spike in coronavirus cases, usually within 4 weeks of reopening. Spain, France, Greece, and Belgium all had this occur, although with varying degrees of severity. Positive test rate is something we're also looking at. I like this indicator because it's an indicator recommended by the World Health Organization as one indicator that COVID spread is under control. It's an indicator that looks at both the overall caseload and whether a country is doing enough testing. And again, that particular resource, Our World in Data, that you see on the slide there, I like it because it's very easy to use, and also because, like the Harvard map, it allows you to track change over time. And then, of course, we're also going to be putting some new program requirements in place. We're still working on those, but I mentioned before, maybe limiting multi-country programs. So, of course, when we look at any given program, we will be examining the extent to which they are able to meet our program requirements. So those are just a few of the key indicators that we're looking at MSU. And I'm going to ask Andrea to share what Vanderbilt is looking at.
Thank you, Maureen. That's a great initial overview here. I'll admit Vanderbilt is looking at a lot of the exact same indicators. This is moving more and more toward an industry standard, I think, that these are all really great to look at. I'll expand on that by saying that Vanderbilt is communicating closely with our international security provider, as well as our international medical insurance provider. And I think that that speaks back to one of the most important things in all of risk assessment, and that is looking at your own institutional resources and who do you have to support you. So when we work with our international security provider, we're going to be asking them specific questions about how they can support those steps that we would be taking in that previous matrix for how can we mitigate risk, and in what way will our security provider be assisting with that. Things like rapid updates on border closures, rapid updates on airline changes to requirements, or testing requirements by country. Additionally, our international medical insurance is going to be leaned on in the sense that we'll be asking them about coverage for COVID testing and whether that will be required to be symptomatic testing or asymptomatic testing. As we all know now, the importance of asymptomatic testing is really key. And so being able to provide that in a way that is easy for our students, our faculty, our staff, anyone traveling to access will be a big part of it. So in addition to what Maureen pointed out, Vanderbilt is also looking at all of those same indicators, but adding in our own personal institutional partners into that equation and looking at how they support us as well.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Next slide, please, Megan. So just before we move into our case study, I wanted to touch very briefly on this other template because Megan has also made it available to you all. This is just to really say that the methodology that I just admittedly very quickly walked through, there are any number of ways that you can apply that methodology, a real number of different types of templates you could use to implement that methodology. So just to provide one example, this is another template that we've used before at MSU. It uses the same methodology, but it's a little bit more simple. It's a little bit more flexible, and it does ask some questions that sort of prompt you to think through different things. So I like this template. I prefer the other one because personally, I prefer to really sort of show my work in terms of really seeing how risk ratings change from an unmitigated risk rating to a mitigated risk rating. But this template absolutely works as well. Just before we move on to the case study, one thing I really want to emphasize with all of the templates that we've made available to you is they are exactly that. They are templates. They're for you to take, edit, make them your own. It's really just to give you an idea of how you could structure a risk assessment. I included some risks and questions to consider just to get you in that frame of mind and get you thinking about it. But by no means is the list of risks that I provided meant to be an inclusive or exhaustive list. That's something we're all still evaluating. So just something I wanted to mention sort of by way of caveat. All right, next slide, Megan. All right. So now we're going to apply a little bit of what we just talked through to a case study. So I'm going to put Andrea on the spot by walking her through a potential program that we at MSU usually run very successfully every year. And we actually right now are in the process of figuring out whether it's going to be a viable program for us. So just for fun, I am going to walk Andrea through some of the details of this program and have her just sort of respond in real time and let me know what she thinks of it. So next slide, please, Megan. I am, in fairness, putting Andrea at a bit of a disadvantage because I'm not giving her, exactly a 15-page description of this program, but I know she'll do a great job.
This feels more realistic to what we usually do.
Yeah. Okay. So Andrea, this program, it's a long-standing program with a history of running very successfully. It's faculty directed, usually semester long, and it's held in Blantyre, Malawi, where MSU medical students study infectious disease at a local clinic. The two on-site faculty members are infectious disease experts and MDs, and they're going to aim to take between 10 to 12 students. Next slide, Megan. I'll give Andrea a little bit more. So housing description, you can all read this, but because MSU does a lot of work in Blantyre, we actually own a small lodge there that has a total of 8 double occupancy rooms. You can see some of the COVID-19 indicators there. One thing I'll just mention is per the Harvard map, they are, quote, on track for containment, which corresponds to a green risk level. Local medical care in Malawi in general, our medical and security assistance provider rates it as a high-risk medical location. There is a local hospital that has an emergency department, but it's considered a high medical risk location because any complex medical situations will probably require evacuation. And I have a few notes there on transportation that you can all read and non-COVID risks that I'm still, of course, going to be paying attention to. So Andrew, we won't hold you to this, but if this program description were to come across your desk, what might you think? What questions would you have? Let us know.
Thank you. Sure. So initially, I think, again, it's important to look at your own institutional resources first when you're thinking through all of this. So it's wonderful that there is a university-owned lodge. And when we're looking at double occupancy rooms, and we've talked about before in our risk mitigation plans, is there a way that we could acquire more housing? Is there a way that we could somehow thin that out so that students may not have to be sharing? That's just one idea, but that's the nitty gritty part of it. Looking at it, as a whole, we need to ask about local medical care. When you say that it's a high medical risk, that's going to be one of the areas that we would really need to work on. So I would start by reaching out to our international security provider that also provides medical assistance as well. If we needed to evac a student or a faculty member out of this area, what are our capabilities here? And that ultimately comes back to the institution that is considering this. You have to think about what the actual capacity is in terms of mitigating that risk specifically in order to make this viable. Since you mentioned that this has a long history of running successfully, I'm going to guess that those pieces would be in place and that we could figure that out, especially with the fact that the faculty leaders seem to have longstanding expertise in this location. That's a great sign. So when we have an experienced faculty leader who has been to the location many times themselves, or perhaps speaks a local language in another context, depending on what that is, those kinds of things are what we look for in terms of risk mitigation and placement on a matrix. And so I would begin by tackling the highest risk scenarios and looking at whether or not we have enough support for this program currently, and then go from there.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrea. All right.
Okay. So I think, before we wrap up, if you could just go back one slide, Megan. I think it's just important to say that, just a quick reminder, we're trying to reduce that impact severity. We're trying to reduce that likelihood, or both. Remember that when you're filling out an assessment template like this, all the things that happen before that first highlighted red bar, those are all the things that happen before you start mitigating. And so you can choose where you want to start tackling the risks. And obviously, you want to see if you can bring the high risks down to medium or low before you tackle the medium risks, because it'll let you know ahead of time if you're talking about a non-starter here. So I just think that that's an important thing. And there's no right way to fill this out. There's no, submit it for approval and it's going to be correct every time. It's going to vary all the time, and it's going to vary based on your institution's resources. So that's just a final thing to keep in mind. Next slide, please. And then as we wrap up today, we just want to bring things back and remind you that this really is about your institution and its risk tolerance. And we've got our little person over there weighing risk and reward. And the reason for that is thinking about the fact that stepping away from global engagement is not a strategy. And we need to, in this field, we need to start really actively planning for how we will engage, even in a small way, baby steps, one at a time. And a lot of that has to do with how can we possibly lead our leadership right now. I know that I can say many of you probably are in a situation where your leadership at your institutions is conducting its own benchmarking, and perhaps you yourself have been asked to conduct some kind of benchmarking. Communication is incredibly important right now, and finding a way to lead your leadership is essential, in the sense that being able to say, we have the tools, we have the resources, we understand how to assess risk, and then ultimately we have the partnerships in order to support student engagement in study abroad. Ultimately, in a perfect world, we would be able to, put this really, to the hands of the students making a decision. But as we know, many of our institutions have had to, keep education abroad paused for a little while longer while we work out how to best support and pull our resources together. So ultimately, I think if I could do anything today, it would be to encourage you to communicate at your institutions and to come together with your leadership, your senior leadership especially, to say, how can we get the ball rolling in a small way? There's unlikely to be a time when we can simply flip a switch and say, okay, study abroad is a go. It's going to be a slow process of picking and perhaps limiting what we can and can't do. If you come from an institution that's typically supported 400 programs, maybe you're going to be looking at supporting 20 or 50 programs for the near future. And so thinking through what our institutions can do and how we can better support each other and the field. That also includes, and I encourage your institution to think about how this affects provider programs, so third-party providers who assist with this. Many of them have obviously been hit very hard by the COVID pandemic in terms of their program locations that they can support and the staff on the ground. And so it's just important to keep in mind that if your institution is one that leans heavily on third-party providers for your education abroad model, communicating with them directly is truly essential right now to find out what they're putting in place. What we know from our field of risk and health and safety specialists is that third-party providers have been working very closely in their environments and in their countries where they operate. And some of the risks that U.S. institutions perceive may or may not be what they're facing in real time. And so that's where that communication piece becomes absolutely essential. And so I would encourage everyone to reach out to your partners right now and get those conversations going. We sincerely thank you for your time today, and we look forward to addressing some of your questions in the time remaining.
Thank you, Andrea and Maureen. We've got a couple of questions and only about 8 minutes or so to answer them. So I'm going to jump right into them and then,
Great.
Yeah. So we'll start with this first one from Deborah Wilson on. It's kind of a two-part question. So she asked, who is on your risk assessment team? And can you talk about how you structure that? And then there was also a specific question about what, Andrea, what you meant about as an international security advisor. So I assume that those would fit into your team. If you could explain both of those things, that'd be great.
Sure, I guess I'll start really quickly. In terms of our risk assessment team, Vanderbilt has a travel risk assessment committee that works specifically to assess programs. And on that committee, we include our risk and insurance management, our vice provost for academic affairs, our legal counsel. We bring in travel experts from around the university who can speak to more specific things. All of that is actually available on our website if anyone is interested in taking a quick look.
We have a very similar membership on our risk committee. One thing I'll mention too, because when you think about risk management team, that could mean the committee, that could also mean who are the day-to-day people. And I think MSU has structured that in a kind of interesting way. So maybe I'll talk about that really quickly. So right now, within MSU International Studies and Programs, I sit as a coordinator, and I also have a director. So we are right now a two-person team called the Office of International Health and Safety. And it's interesting because although I work extremely closely with our Office for Education Abroad, and most of my job responsibilities are related to education abroad, I'm actually in a separate unit that from education abroad. And I think that's actually a structure that's worked quite well at MSU. It does require that I'm maintaining very strong communication and strong relationships with our education abroad office, but existing separately is, I think, a nice way to keep risk management focused very specifically on its mission, and not having to worry quite as much about things like marketing to students, budgets, things like that. Not that I am insensitive to those, but I don't need to worry about making budgets work when I am, for example, giving a risk management recommendation, which is a challenge, but from a supporting health and safety perspective, it's one way to structure things that has some benefits.
Thank you. Speaking of budgets, cost is obviously something we talk a lot about in study abroad, as it can be something that prohibits students from studying abroad. So Jordan Cayley has asked that and stated that contingency plans often involve extra housing, transportation options, and they're asking who absorbs these extra expenses. Is it a university cost, a student cost, and things like that, and how you might consider that if you do. Maureen, I know you mentioned that sometimes you don't necessarily, it's not part of that entire risk mitigation, but if you have any thoughts on cost of those things.
Oh yeah, that is such a good question, and something that I think is one of the biggest challenges related to thinking about resuming programming right now is that I certainly stand by, I think we all stand by the measures that we might need to implement to support student health and safety on these programs, but you know, to the participants' excellent point, a lot of those have cost implications. So the short answer at MSU, I mean, we're still working through this right now, but it is unfortunate that it is potential that some of our programs will end up costing a lot more this year than they have in previous years. But our education abroad team, who's really fantastic, they're trying to get creative. And one thing that actually this has really forced us all to do, and we're trying to sort of have a silver lining approach to this, which is that, to a point that Andrea made before, we are certainly not going to be running the usual number of programs. So instead, we are most likely going to be focusing on a much smaller subset of programs that might give some of our colleges that sponsor these programs a bit more flexibility to put some of their resources towards offsetting those higher program fees, things of that nature. I know one program actually says, you know, I might be able to save a little bit here because I normally travel to multiple countries, but I'm really going to get back to basics, focus on what do I really want my students to get out of this education abroad experience, and how do I do that by focusing on one, you know, doing a deeper dive into one country instead of doing a tour around other countries, and they're finding some savings there. So that's not just, that's not to sweep the very valid concern under the rug. It's tough, and I have not figured this out, but we are trying to think about ways to keep whatever small number of programs are going to run as accessible to students as possible.
And if your institution offers any kind of scholarship programming, thinking through starting, you know, those baby steps and not opening all programs and you know, opening the floodgates at one time is a great way to make sure that you're harnessing those scholarship resources as best as you can for the students who need it the most.
Perfect. I think we've got time for one more question. Jessica has said that a lot of the considerations we've talked about today are focused on risk on the ground in a host country. And so she is wondering, where do you start to consider the risk of travel in general, in terms of figuring out how to see how the travel can happen at all? There's risk in flying, there's risk in enforcing physical distancing, and just a little bit of information on your perspective on those specific risks before you even get to the country.
If I can just jump in here really quickly, I think what we have to remember is that those risks always existed. And so I don't think we should try to apply them to a COVID risk necessarily, more other than in the logistical planning and the way that we worked through that matrix is how will that risk have an impact on your program potentially. But again, we have to think about risks in the sense that they have always existed. I have seen some questions pop up about, you know, the how will, you know, when we do have a vaccine affect the way that we process a risk assessment. And the thing is that, you know, I think it'll be a long time before we know how effective that vaccine is, how many people take it, what it looks like around the world. These things are going to exist for a long time. And so I think we have to, in the field, move toward a place where we're accepting a certain level of risk, as that it's just going to be standard, and remembering that our students have agency and that they can choose to participate in a program, and we all choose to, get in our cars and drive or set foot on a plane. That's just going to be part of the landscape moving forward.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to pull back up the slides and we will wrap up. Thank you both, Andrea and Maureen, for joining us today, and thank you to all of the attendees. If you are interested in more or other resources on risk mitigation, you can check out the Library of Resources. I posted a couple times in the chat direct links to the templates that were discussed today. There is a recording of this webinar will also appear there in the Library of Resources next week, and there is a recording of the last webinar there as well for you to reference. I will also post the slides there. Please keep an eye out in the future for some ideas webinars to be posted on our website. Additionally, as Heidi mentioned at the beginning, the Ideas Grant Competition is going to be announced in mid-November 2020. Until then, following this webinar, you'll receive that email that I mentioned requesting your feedback via a survey. But we thank you in advance for providing your feedback through that survey. So thank you all so much for joining. We wish you a safe rest of your day and fall season, and we hope to see you on a webinar again soon.